If there's one thing that is absolutely true about the human heart, it is the fact that the human heart is wickedly impatient. Okay, in today's video, guys, we're going to talk about how our impatience can rob us of God's promise to us, from God's best for us, according to his will. So, it's a very practical topic. You might be asking yourself, Nadia, how is it that you decided to talk about this? So I'm currently reading through the book of 1 Samuel and, just reading chapter by chapter. And this theme, really stood out to me. We're going to talk about this topic in light of Saul, who was the first king of Israel. And there's a cardinal moment, in Saul's life, a defining moment, a critical moment in his life that sort of forever altered the course of his life, And so we're going to analyze that story, this episode, and ask ourselves, what can we practically learn? Because, I was like reading this and I was like, and then I ended up like writing notes on notes and like things that God was like, speaking to me about. And so I wanted to share these thoughts with you, and hopefully you can find that, useful and helpful for your own walk with Jesus, because if you're a true follower of Christ, if you're in the faith, your patience will be tested, how you act in certain situations will be life altering. I believe every Christian is tested. And so, this is the beauty of the Old Testament, is that, it doesn't have flawless people. It has people who are flawed, how they behaved in certain situations, and for us to learn, because these are the men and women who walked before us, and so I think there's something very powerful that we can learn practically as Christians from this moment in Saul's life. So before I go into my points, let me read the excerpt of what I'm talking about. So this story is actually found in 1 Samuel chapter 13. So, Israel is in constant battles with these Philistines, and so it's one of those moments where, Philistines are advancing against Israel. Saul is with his men in Gilgal, waiting on Samuel to show up. It's been 7 days. Samuel has not showed up, he's sort of late. The men sort of start to scatter. Saul starts to panic, and he basically ends up taking on Samuel's role as a priest, and he offers the burnt offerings to the Lord, and then Samuel shows up finally, and he's like, what have you done, fool? Like, why have you disobeyed the Lord's command, and then he gives him the prophecy that his kingdom will not endure anymore, and that God's going to find a man after his own heart. So, but let me read, because I do want us to get the real context here. Saul remained in Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, bring me the burnt offerings, the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offerings. Just as he finished making the offerings, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now Philistines will come down against me in Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. So, he's talking about obviously David here. So here's a defining moment. This is the first moment that we see in Saul's life that, his sort of downfall begins. He's a king, his men are beginning, trembling with fear. They're beginning to scatter. Samuel's supposed to come. He's late. He's not coming, and so what does Saul do? Saul gets impatient. He starts to act out of fear and out of his emotions rather than out of truth and out of obedience. I feel like every Christian will have a moment in his or her life where his or her faith will be deeply tested, and it has to do with a certain situation. Maybe God gave you a promise about marriage and that has not come to fulfillment yet. Maybe God gave you a promise about a child and you can't get pregnant, work a certain job. I don't know what it is, I think there are so many situations in our lives as Christians where God will absolutely test our faith, and how we behave in those critical moments will be life-defining moments, So perhaps God, like for instance, relationships, because I'm going to use a relationship because I feel like this is the most practical, example that everybody can relate to, or a lot of people can relate to. Let's say, that God give you a promise about marriage and a spouse, and you feel like God put that on your heart, But you know what? Samuel is late. It's been years. It's been more than 7 days. Samuel has not shown up. The Lord has not delivered. God is late, right? Like, where is Samuel? There's a critical situation, the men are scattering, or you've been waiting for so long. You're over 30. You're not married. You thought you would have had a family and kids by now, or you thought you would have this house by now, or you thought you would have this child by now, but you can't get pregnant, so there's a critical situation that, seems to be unraveling, and you feel like you're losing control. You feel like God is not being faithful. God is not being true. Where is God? Where is Samuel? I don't know what the cry of your heart is, but I feel like in all of our lives as Christians, as true servants of the Lord, if you're truly in the faith, God will give you a promise, and then God will allow that situation to get really bad before it gets better, And as the situation gets hopeless and really bad, God is looking how you're behaving. How are you going to act? What are you going to do when things are unraveling? When things are just sort of falling apart, when you thought you were going to be in this point in life and you're not there, How does your heart behave? Where do you go? What do you do? And what we see here in Saul's life is that Saul begins to get impatient with God. He disobeys God's command. And then this can look like many things. You're tired of waiting on the Lord. You're tired of praying for that godly spouse. You're tired of, you sort of start to compromise, so you go out with that guy who, you're kind of wondering if he really is a Christian, kind of like, you sort of start to close your eye on certain things, because you're tired of being alone. You're tired of waiting on the Lord. You're starting to doubt God's goodness. You're starting to doubt God's faithfulness. So you start to sort of like lower your standards, or you start to compromise on things. Like deep down, if you're really honest with yourself, this person's probably not truly what the Lord has for you, but because you don't want to be alone, you're tired of being alone, and that's a greater fear in your heart, you start to behave out of that place of fear. And the things that you should have caught out and called out, and rather than removing and saying, God, I'd rather not compromise my standards and walk with you and by myself, rather than, give a chance to somebody who I see you showing to me who they're not truly a believer. You feel like there's these things, that are bothering you, but you just rather sort of like set it to the side. And you can start to compromise, on what God has for you, rather than seeking the Lord and perhaps making the hard decision of walking away or ending that relationship. You just let it develop because you decided to, rather than waiting on the Lord, and praying and fasting perhaps, and just, staying put, being still, knowing that God is God, you decided to take the matter into your own hands. So you start disobeying. Like for instance, the Bible says don't be unequally yoked, right? But you decide, he kind of goes to church, but deep down he's not really a believer. He just goes to church, right? So you start to compromise. So you start to disobey God's command. So the first thing that Saul does is like God gave him clear instructions to wait on Samuel, and Saul disobeys God's command. He disobeys God's command. He takes the matter into his own hands in that critical situation, rather than staying put and saying, even if Samuel doesn't show up, my faith and trust is not in Samuel. My ultimate trust is in the Lord. It's not in Samuel. So God can save us with or without Samuel. It doesn't matter. But instead, Saul disobeys and he says, Samuel is late. God is late. God's not with me. So let me let me lean into my own understanding, essentially. He's starting to have doubts about God's goodness, right? And that is where the enemy wants us to be, in this place of fear. Rather than living by the truth, what you know to be true of the God's word, you start to give in to the lies of the enemy. You start to act out of place of fear, because here's the thing, perfect love casts out all fear. If you know that you're truly loved by the Lord and that God truly has the best in mind for you, you're gonna follow truth rather than your emotions. But we see that Saul begins to act out of this place of emotions, out of fear, losing control. He's seeing the men are scattering, the situation is getting bad. So rather than being like, I'm going to trust the Lord, I'm going to be still, I'm just going to pray more, I'm going to lead my men to look up to the Lord. Instead of that, Saul begins to lean into his own understanding. He starts to compromise. And look at what he does. He's a king. He knows the law of Moses. So he steps out of his role as king and assumes the wrong role of a priest. He has no business touching the offering, doing priestly duties. He's a king, but he disobeys another command. And this is what happens when we start to disobey the Lord in one area and we think this is not a big deal. It often leads to disobedience in many other areas of our life. We start to step out of our calling. This can look very spiritual too. This can look like, oh, I'm going to compromise on this person, but you know what? We're going to go to church like more often because he's not really a Christian and I want him to be in church more. So you get, sort of like you might be like, okay, let's go to church more. Let's do these things. So it looks like you're doing all these spiritual things, but the motivations of your heart are wrong. The place from which you're acting is wrong. And so, you start to abandon the place to which God called you. Maybe this is a season for you to be alone. Maybe this is the season for you not to be in a relationship and be committed to the things that God has for you. But because you don't want to be alone, you very in a spiritual manner be like, oh, I'm in this relationship. He's not really a Christian, but let's go to church more often. Let's do, so it looks like a very spiritual sort of answer. Like we see in Saul's life, he just starts to offer, he assumes basically priestly duties, but he's being disobedient, even though it looks like he's being, really courageous. But what's motivating him is fear and not truly reverence and trust in the Lord. And God sees that and God looks at that, and that's wicked before the Lord, because externally you're looking like you're doing the right maybe thing, like a very spiritual thing, but it's not what God has for you in this season. But that is not what the Lord wants you to be, focusing on this season, So this is a very important thing to note here. But ultimately, the reason why the Lord was so upset with Samuel is because the situation revealed the motivations of his heart. We often as human beings, even as followers of Christ, we don't know fully what motivates us until, a situation arises, until God allows a situation, a critical situation to arise, and then we behave in certain ways, and then we see really what drives us. If we're still wise to see. Saul in our case was blinded by pride. He couldn't even see what the wrong things he was doing, right? So it's a slippery slope. Patience is a fruit of the Spirit. And God will often develop patience in our heart by allowing us to be in situations where, it just seems like we're tired of waiting. We no longer want to be faithful to the Lord. We want to abandon our post. We don't want to be any more committed. We start to doubt God's goodness. We start to act out of place of fear rather than truth and love. We start to take shortcuts. We start to close our eyes on certain things, when we know better, right? Like, how important it is, when critical situations arise in our lives, when Samuel is late, when God doesn't seem to deliver, what you do in those moments will define the course of your life. And we see that Saul failed and his kingdom, unraveled afterwards. But, there's another man in the Bible, like Joseph, for instance, right? And Joseph, time and time again, shows us how in every critical moment in his life, when things did not go his way, when things seemed to go from bad to worse, right? Like it looked like, okay, he was sold into slavery. He ended up, at Potiphar's house, and he was doing well. He was, promoted. He was the head CEO, and then boom, a situation arises, and, this woman tries to sleep with him, but he shows faithfulness, and then he suffers the consequences. He ends up in jail, in prison. And it looks like, that could have been a moment of Joseph's demise. It was a critical moment, and yet he passed the test. He trusted the Lord. He didn't act out of place of his emotions. He could have very easily fallen into that woman's temptation and said, I don't have a family here. I don't have anyone. I got sold by my brother. He could have acted from a place of resentment and fear and doubt in God's goodness. And yet Joseph decided to act out of place of trust in the Lord, because he literally says, how can I do this great evil against God? It's not even just against his master. Against God, right? Like his heart was upright. He was not going to act out of place of his emotions. He was going to act out of place of truth. He could have gotten impatient with the Lord and been like, what, screw all this, He was smart. He was talented. He was no idiot. Like, I'm pretty sure that if Joseph wanted to, he could have even escaped prison. He didn't have to stay there. But Joseph stayed put in the place where God had him, even though that place was extremely uncomfortable for him. Being in that prison was uncomfortable. I'm sure that's not where he wanted to be in life, right? And yet he was faithful to the place where God had him. It's such a testament of great faith. And I just believe that oftentimes we as Christians, if you're truly a follower of Christ, what you do as a Christian, as a believer in a moment of great discomfort to your flesh, to great discomfort, to where you want to be, how you behave in those moments that's what reveals the caliber of your faith. Do you really know? Because, being a Christian is not what you say, or the songs that you really sing and whatnot. It's what you do in critical moments, in moments of great discomfort, in moments of great confusion. Like, why did this happen, Lord? How you behave in those moments are the moments that it determines what kind of vessel you're going to be, right? So we see in Saul's life, he panicked, he feared, rather than trusting in the Lord, rather than staying put and knowing that God literally can save him with or without Samuel, right? He takes the matter into his own hands. He leans into his own understanding. He refuses to acknowledge the power and the sovereignty of the Lord. And that was his cardinal sin, disobedience, fear, acting out of emotion rather than truth, jumping out of his calling into, some other priestly duty that was not for him, right? But a different example is that example of Joseph, a man who time and time again got tested very heavily. Like most would have failed the exam time and time again. And yet Joseph time and time again chose to act out of place of trust, truth, in understanding that God was sovereign and God was powerful. And rather than, becoming impatient, he allowed the fruit of the Spirit of great patience and perseverance to be developed in him. That in a sense, developed his character, because that's how a godly character is formed. How we act in critical moments. It can rob us from God's promise. And I'm not saying that all of us can make mistakes. And I'm not saying that God cannot redeem our situation. But I do believe that there is a better way to live a Christian life. There is a wiser path to walk. I mean, look at the life of Samson, right? Like he was, God's servant, God's mission was accomplished, at the end of the day. But by what means? Did he have to walk such a treacherous and terrible road if he was obedient, right? Like he didn't have to. Things didn't have to end up in that kind of way. He had free will. He chose to act time and time again in unwise ways. I don't know why, but this story of Saul was so powerful to me. And I just want to encourage everyone, no matter where God has you in life, whether you're not where you thought you wanted to be in life, if you're a believer in Jesus, and you feel discouraged about your situation, stay put, be faithful, be a Christian that lives by truth, not feelings, okay? Be resolute. Choose to trust God no matter what the odds, no matter how dark the path gets, no matter how impossible things look, because God is powerful to change your situation within like a day, okay? Within hours. God is powerful. But how you behave in these critical situations matter. There's always going to be that temptation to take the matters into your hands, to lean to your understanding. Satan will always want to make you question God's will, God's love for you. But don't forget that he truly loves you, and God has the best for you. And just because things are not happening on your timeline doesn't mean that God is not at work. The whole entire time, God was at work in Joseph's life. The Bible says time and time again that the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. Even though physically it looked like the Lord was not with Joseph. Like he looked like a total loser, right? For a very long time. But that is the path of the Lord. That is the path of God's servant. That is the path in which God develops, his servant's character. Okay. So I don't know. Hopefully this was a very encouraging sort of like podcast, maybe session. And I encourage you to stay put. No, do not let your impatience rob you the best of what God has for you, All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.